Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Daduna Gohreidze. I'm FIDIC General Counsel, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, which is part of the FIDIC Contract webinar series. The topic of our webinar today is all you need to know about the FIDIC Green Book 2021. This is the first FIDIC webinar since we've held our very successful Global Infrastructure Conference in Geneva earlier this month. The event was a complete success with more than 500 participants joining from all over the world, from different parts of the world, and it has been really rewarding to meet in person after some time. We will be looking forward to organizing other face-to-face events in future, starting with an event which may be of interest to many of you who are attending this webinar today, and that event is our International Contract Users Conference that will be held in London in November. Please also make note of the 2-hour online webinars that will be held after this event. I'm delighted that for today's webinar, we have more than 1,100 participants joining us from more than 130 countries. This demonstrates great interest in FIDIC contracts and their applications throughout the world. The FIDIC Green Book is the FIDIC short form of contract that was, and the 2021 version was launched as an update to the 99 short form of contract. The FIDIC Green Book 2021 is the latest FIDIC contracts publication, and I'm very pleased that today it will be presented to you by the drafters of the contract. And that gives me a great pleasure to introduce the speakers of our webinar to you, starting with the chair of the FIDIC Contracts Committee, Vincent Leloup, who is also a principal drafter of the FIDIC Green Book and a member of the FIDIC President list. Mahmoud Abu Hussein, who has recently appointed as the vice chair of the FIDIC Contracts Committee, and congratulations to Mahmoud for this great achievement, who is also a member of the task group responsible for drafting of the FIDIC Green Book. Also, we have 2 other speakers, Robert West and James Perry, members of the task group and also the members of the FIDIC President list and certified adjudicators. Before I hand over to Vincent, we have one question to ask, one poll question to see how many of you have used or are currently using 99 FIDIC version, 99 FIDIC Green Book or FIDIC Green Book 2021. Please answer the poll question. Interesting results. 27% are using the FIDIC, of these attendees are using the FIDIC Green Book first edition. Some 4% are using the new FIDIC Green Book, and some of them, 56%, have never used the FIDIC Green Book. That gives a great audience to present this Green Book to you, and with that, I hand over to Vincent. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Daduna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. That's my pleasure to take you through this overview of the FIDIC Green Book 2021 and its new features together with my colleagues, Mahmoud, Jim, and Robert. So let me share my screen with you and just give you some few introductory words about the intent behind the drafting of the 2021 Green Book. First of all, we did a market study back in 2018 in order to assess the use of the Green Book 99 edition at that time. Or you may remember that the scope of the 99 edition of the Green Book was for small projects, small work value project, and for a project of short duration, of short time for completion. There was some indicative reference which was taken in the FIDIC contract guide at the time, giving an example of a project of less than $500,000 and of duration less than 6 months, although by no means that was meant to be a firm guidance regarding the conditions of project in which using the Green Book. What turned out in practice from the market survey result, which you can see on the screen here for 2018, is that the Green Book was mostly used for projects above $1 million value, and actually significant proportion, 18% of them were for more than $10 million. And in terms of time for completion, the large majority of the works covered by the Green Book 99 was for projects of less than 1 year, but still 11% for more than 2 years. We also took into account that there was a limited use of the Green Book by the multilateral development banks, as a difference with the FIDIC Red Book or the FIDIC Yellow Book, and the sales accordingly were lower. So the MDBs generally were preferring to use their own short form of contract for projects of capital value less than $10 million. In terms of the feedback from the market, users were commending the simplicity and brevity of the 99 Green Book, but however, expressed the desire to see more usual construction administration features in the book. You may remember that there was no limitation of liability clause, there was no expressed defect notification period, the taking over certificate as such was not a defined term, etc., as well as a clearer risk allocation. So this is the composition of the task group team, and the four of us are happy to be with you today to present the Green Book 2021, for which the objective of use are, first of all, to serve as an alternative to the 2017 FIDIC Red and Yellow Book. As you can appreciate, those two forms of contract are for somehow sophisticated project of larger capital value, typically than those covered by the Green Book. They do require to have some contract administration resources mobilized so as to be able to follow all of the procedures set out in those contracts. So they fit they're fit for their own purpose, and they serve a market segment, which is for those sophisticated projects I was referring to, or large capital value projects. And the Green Book is just serving another segment of the industry, which is for projects where the perceived level of risk is low, and all where parties wish to use a form which does not require significant contract administration and management resources, and which is simple of use. So typically, the new Green Book is perfectly fit for the arena of so-called small works. I mentioned that because that's a definition used by many multilateral development banks for works of capital value less than $10 million. But also, it can be used for a project of larger value. So I would like to insist on that point, because we know by experience that each and every time we refer to a threshold in FIDIC, the market is generally quick to take that threshold as being an absolute one. So we absolutely do not want users to be misled by this $10 million threshold. It's an indicative one, and typically you can use a Green Book for larger capital value project as long as the two conditions are met. The condition 1 for the perceived level of risk, and the condition 2, which might be also a case where, despite the fact that there might be a large capital value, despite the fact that there might be some significant level of risk to handle, the two parties prefer to work along something which does not require significant contract administration and management resources. So from my perspective as an hydraulic engineer, for example, I'm perfectly comfortable to work with the Green Book 2021 on a water supply, wastewater infrastructure pipeline project, for example, of capital value $20 or $30 million that does perfectly fit the needs of such kind of project. So the motto we had in mind when drafting the new Green Book was to be concise, to have something which is flexible, easygoing, innovative also. You will see some innovations and during our presentation, new concept that we introduced, such as the prolongation cost as a liquidated damage provision, and to be user-friendly. So our future will tell, and you will tell us in practice whether we have achieved that objective. In terms of the structure, you will see that we go from 15 clauses to 14 clauses before. In terms of number of pages, we were around 10, now we are at 26, we have 10,000 words roughly, and that's exactly in the same type of extent that you can find for standard forms, standard short forms of contract that you see with multilateral development banks, who are also in the range of 10,000 to 11,000 words. You have, as usual, the particular conditions, Part A contract data, that the reflection of what happens with FIDIC forms in the Gold Book in 2008, and Part B special provisions, plus a few sample forms which are provided. One of the big innovation of our form, of our new form, is the fact that we have included also more guidance forms for communication between the parties, with notices along the execution of the works, for taking over certificates, for claim notices, etc., etc., all in the spirit of being as user-friendly as possible. And that's the first time that such amount of communication form is provided in a FIDIC contract. We have also extensive guidance notes. And so altogether, the book itself, of course, might look definitely thicker than what you had back in 99, but do not be misled by the thickness of the book. You have 26 pages of general conditions, and then you have a large proportion of guidance notes, forms which are there to be provided for guidance to the users. So in terms of the main new features, we have an engineer being now introduced, and the main reason for doing so is that we aim at capturing a wider scope of project than with the 99 edition. Typically for those larger capital value projects, an engineer, in the sense of having an independent third party mobilized by the employer in order to assist the employer and to act as agent of the employer in the administration of the contract. That's typically something which happens more frequently on larger capital value projects, but we're also wary of the fact that even for small projects in many jurisdictions, having a third-party engineer is extremely frequent, and even sometimes might be mandatory at law, especially when there are structural works at stake. We made sure to be compliant with the terminology used in the 2017 suite of contract, Red, Yellow, Silver Book, and to apply, of course, the same principles where applicable to the Green Book, so as to have an harmony between Red, Yellow, Silver, and Green Books. As I said, it's an alternative to yellow and green and red, sorry. So as a consequence, you've got all possible degrees of contractors design which are catered for. I would say the standard scenario is a scenario where you have the employer being in charge of the design, some portion of possible contractors design, but you can also switch to a full contractors design scenario, so to a full design build scenario, and you have in our guidance notes some provisions to be used in that effect. As I said in introduction, the market was in need of the introduction of usual terms that you find in the construction administration, in the administration of a construction operation, and that you have also in other books like Red, Yellow, and Silver Book. So now you have a taking over certificate being a defined term, a date of completion as newly introduced in the 2017 suite, the Dnp Performance Certificate. You still have the 6 payment options which were already there in the 99 edition of the Green Book, but with more flesh to it, with more provisions explaining how they operate. You have now also environmental health and safety provisions. So you have QA testing provisions and the typical boilerplate provisions, which were not always there in the 99 edition, such as matters of IP confidentiality, the limitation of liability I was referring to earlier on, plus new definitions such as prolongation cost. And prolongation cost, in fact, is one of the new, significant new innovation brought by that form, operating as a liquidated damage provision for the sake of simplicity of the administration of the contract between the parties, in addition to the other liquidated damages provision that were already there in the 99 Green Book, such as in the case of termination. That's something that people tend to forget often and believe that the Green Book 21 is bringing that provision for liquidated damages in case of termination as being something new, but that's not the case. And of course, we have contractors delay damages provision there, plus a tabulated summary of contractors' risk, employers' risk, sorry, and contractors' entitlements accordingly, as also was requested by the market. Some new provisions with an insurance certificate to make it easy for the employer to verify that the right insurance is in place. And all of the insurance requirements are now tabulated in the contract data. The stage suspension and termination processes with new grounds for termination and suspension, typically when there is non-compliance with a determination of the engineer or a decision of the adjudicator, and that echoes exactly what is being done under the 2017 suite. Claims and variations are now two separate routes. You remember they were in one same clause in the 99 edition. Now we have two clearly separate routes, as provided also in the 2017 edition, typically to avoid legal issues of unjust enrichment or things of that kind that can arise in the context of variation, if time bar applies. But no time bar at all applies in our Green Book 2021. Well, we have a simplified claim procedure with some timeline which is given, but there is no direct consequence of a breach of the timeline through a time bar. But as usual, there are provisions dealing with what would then be a breach of contract and which could cause a loss to the innocent party. Engineers agreement determination process now is well set out, and for the adjudication side we have three options that my colleague Robert will present to you later on. And arbitration by default, we have the Icc Rules of Arbitration, and within those rules the expedited procedure provided by Icc with one arbitrator and 6 months to get the award. So just as a quick summary, you can find that now in the contract data, flexibility and ease of choices, the insurance table, which is expanding on what was done in the 2016 Blue Book, the 6 payment options, again, which were already there in the 99 edition, but we have expanded on them. So it's all easy then to fill that up at bidding stage or tender stage and to get the contract document prepared. Flowcharts also to assist the users in understanding the contract machinery. My colleague Robert will tell you about the claim process later on. Mahmoud will tell you about the payment process. And also the variation process. Now you have some flowchart to assist people in understanding the way our machinery operates, plus some extensive guidance notes. It's multiplied by 3 in volume against the 99 edition, but we thought that it would be very useful for the market, bearing in mind that as a difference with Red, Yellow or Silver Book, we don't have a standalone guide to our Green Book. So somehow the purpose and objective of having those guidance notes was to serve the dual purpose of being guidance notes for the drafters of the particular conditions of contract, but also guidance notes to the users at large as to the way our general conditions are to be interpreted. No big change regarding the timeline in the sense that you have the usual steps in a FIDIC construction administration setup, but everything has a difference with Red, Yellow or Silver Books, or Red and Yellow, sorry. The contract will be in effect and legally binding as of the contract agreement stage, and the contract agreement form records the offer of the contractor and the acceptance of the employer, so all in one. So there is no letter of tender and letter of acceptance as in other books. That's the typical setup, the relation between employer and contractor, Green Book, the adjudicator being the third party neutral between the two in charge of dispute avoidance and dispute resolution, and any relation between the employer and the engineer can be governed typically by a FIDIC White Book. And regarding the definitions, in clause 1, you have some traditional FIDIC definitions like cost, but with some new elements like the prolongation cost, which are now part of the definition of cost, and that's also a standalone definition, prolongation cost, covering on-site and off-site overheads associated with an compensable extension of the time for completion, and definition of variation. So you will find easily your way through when you are already familiar with the rest of our contract, Red, Yellow, Silver, but also if you are familiar with the Green Book 99 edition. Right, so I would stop at this stage and turn over to my colleague Mahmoud, who will present to you a few other features under the contract. Mahmoud, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. It's always a pleasure to be with you all, and especially with the 3 out of 4 musketeers. It's been quite an enjoyable journey drafting the second edition of the Green Book. So pleasure to be with the 3 musketeers again. Next slide, please. So as Vincent mentioned, unlike the case of the first edition of the Green Book and in alignment with the 2017 suite, variations now are under an independent clause, clause 7, and separated from claims, which are now under clause 13, with express provisions on the 2 distinct routes for entitlement to money and or EOT. Next click, please. So right to vary under subclause 7.1, the engineer may initiate variations at any time with a long stop, so any time before the issue of the taken over certificate, with the exception for variations to remedy defects not attributable to the contractor. Next slide, please. So under the second edition now, the contractor has the right to object or reject variations, and those are grouped under subclause 7.1.2. The contractor shall not be bound by a variation which results in omission of work to be carried out by the employer or others, unless the employer pays an all incurred cost plus 10% of the value of omitted work. And this is one example of the expanded LD's provisions under the second edition, which Vincent alluded to earlier. The second is the variation being unforeseeable, and that's a defined term, of course, having regard to the scope and nature of the works, or the variation will adversely affect the contractor's ability to comply with its HSE obligations. Next click, please. Valuation of variations now with the introduction of the engineer, as Vincent mentioned, now the parties have a more balanced contract administration tool. The engineer under subclause 3.5 will act neutrally and will not be deemed to be acting for the employer. So the engineer will proceed under subclause 3.5 to agree or determine entitlement to money and or EOT. There are multiple valuation options. They are similar to the first edition of the Green Book, and they vary from lump sum to rates or prices in the contract or based on the contract or derived from the cost plus or day work. And of course, this order is an implied order of preference, or this is a preferred sequence in which they are listed. Finally, to align with the new novelty under the second edition relating to the prolongation cost, valuation of variations will take due regard of any associated prolongation cost, if any. Next, please. The variation procedure, you have 2 routes. The first being the retrospective valuation, which is similar to the 2017 edition. I think you are all familiar with that. This will be by instruction. So the engineer will instruct the variation by notice. Then the contractor shall be bound and will proceed expeditiously unless one of the rejection grounds apply. And then the contractor will subsequently submit a proposal for adjustment to the contract price and or EOT, and the valuation will be proceeding under 7.2. The second route is the prospective route, which is by request for variation proposal from the engineer. The contractor can either submit a variation proposal or choose not to by given reason relating to 7.1.2. If the proposal is accepted, then the engineer would notify its consent and will instruct the variation, including the money and EOT adjustment in one go. However, if there is no consent, the engineer may still instruct the variation under the first route under 7.1.1a, and in that case, the above procedure would apply. Next slide, please. So the valuation of the works now, this is a expanded feature under the second edition, as Vincent mentioned. This was already addressed under the first edition in the appendix and in the guidance notes. Now the contract data are having some elaborate write-up for the methods and the options clauses detailing the valuation, measurement, and payment, and who bears the risk of the BOQ, contractor or employer, with an easy box-ticking manner for the methods and the option, the corresponding option clause, and then the works will be valued and paid for accordingly. Next click, please. As you can see here on the screen, the 6 options or methods that Vincent mentioned previously, you can just tick the box for one or multiple options, and then the corresponding option clause will apply, which sets out clearly the payment, the measurement, and who bears the risk of the quantities. As you can see here on your right-hand side for option C, this risk is borne by the contractor. Next, please. Under option D, remeasurement with bill of quantities, which is more aligned with the Red Book scenario. So this obviously mentions, this is under the highlighted text, that the quantities risk is borne by the employee. Next slide, please. Advance payment, again, this was not part of the first edition. Now it is part of the general conditions and the referring to the contract data. And the contract data would set out if the advance payment is allowed, and if so, its percentage, currency, and whether a guarantee is required. A new provision under the second edition stipulating that the advance payment shall be exclusive for the contractor's obligations under the contract. And obviously this is to cater for cases of contractors using the advance payment to fund other projects. So the engineer would certify within 7 days, and the employer would pay within 28 days the advance payment after receipt of the application, advance payment guarantee, and the performance security, if any. Changes in cost, again, not in the first edition, it was covered under the guidance notes. Now, again, referring to the contract data would set out if adjustment is allowed. Obviously, this will take due regard of the duration of the contract. If it's longer than 18 months or so, then adjustment will be allowed. And if so, that will be in accordance with the schedule of cost indexation. Next, please. So the payment procedure for interim payments, next, please, the next 2 clicks. So the engineer would issue the IPC within 14 days of its receipt of the statement and supporting documents, and the employer would pay 14 days later. For the final payment, so the contractor will issue the draft final statement after the 14 days from the issue of the performance certificate. And then the contractor and the engineer would agree the final amount. Once agreed, the contractor will submit the final statement along with the discharge. And then 28 days later, the engineer will issue the final payment certificate, and 28 days later, the employer will make payment. As you can see, all in all, the payment durations are almost 50% of the durations under the 2017 suite. Next click, please. And next slide. So risk allocation. Some of the drafting objectives mentioned in Vincent's previous slide. So we aimed at maintaining the balanced risk allocation, simplifying the contractual machinery, ensuring clarity and certainty for the parties. And as a result, the employer's risk and the corresponding contractor's entitlements are tabulated in one table under subclause 11.1. All other risks are to be borne by the contractor. Then those entitlements are subject to clause 13 claims, unless a variation is instructed as a result of one of the employer's risks. In that case, clause 7 variation shall apply without any requirement to proceed under the claims procedure. The contractor's entitlement would vary based on whether the delay is compensable or excusable, as addressed under the foreword and the guidance notes. The guidance notes would provide quite an elaborate explanation of the risk allocation and the table under subclause 11.1, how it is applied in practice with examples. So this is a view of the table. Next click, please. So this is the table referred to under 11.1.3, which lists the employer's risk and the corresponding contractor's entitlement. And compensable and excusable delays will be mentioned in the foreword and the guidance notes. And for those of you who are familiar with the SCL delay and disruption protocol will also understand that these are terminologies that are quite common in the construction industry. So whenever you see under the column contractor's entitlement cost plus profit or cost plus EOT, so either cost plus profit and or EOT or cost and or EOT, if you can click to circle those lists. So once you see those, then this means this is a compensable delay, and entitlement will be EOT plus the cost or the cost plus profit, which would include the novelty, which is the prolongation cost over the duration of the EOT. If you see EOT only, then this is an excusable delay. So the contractor is entitled only to the delay without any cost entitlement, not even the prolongation cost. Next slide, please. So this addresses the contractor's risk and the corresponding employer's entitlement under subclause 11.2. You can read those. You will have the slide deck. Sorry, the next slide, please. So insurance, as Vincent said, again, with the same drafting objectives I mentioned earlier. So for ease of use, clarity, certainty, and make it ease of reference for the parties, there are only short general conditions supported by a detailed insurance table in the contract data. This is in alignment with the 2016 Blue Book. All the insurance requirements, including the insuring party, which echoes back to the 99 suite, insurance cover, deductible, exclusions, if any, are set out in the detailed contract data. Now, one of the novelties also under the second edition is the insurance certificate to evidence that the insuring party has indeed effected and maintained and paid the premium for the insurances that he is required to effect under the contract, with a sample form for the insurance certificate annexed to the particular conditions. The form, thank you, Vincent. The form is to be issued or endorsed by the insurer, not the broker, and it references and uses the defined terms under the contract and addresses all the insurance cover. So it could be one cover or multiple covers by one insurer. If it is multiple insurers, then you will have multiple certificates. Standard terms and conditions, standard insurance terms like cross liability for third-party liability insurance or waiver of subrogation, the limit on the cancellation of the policy without before notifying the parties. So everything is in the sample form. Obviously, this is to cater for employers or the parties who lack capability or capacity or specialist knowledge of the insurance market. However, as a safety net, and in case this insurance certificate does not work as intended, or in case the contractor submits an insurance certificate which is not in compliance with the form, the employer has always the right to request copy of the insurance policies so that he can have a thorough review of those policies provided by the contractor. Next slide, please. This shows the tabulated insurance table in the contract data. It is quite detailed and covering all the requirements. And on the right-hand side, you see the sample of the insurance certificate, which I mentioned. So This concludes my part. I would now turn over to my colleague, Jim. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. And now over to Jim for a presentation of other features of the new Green Book. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vincent. And hello, everybody. It's very encouraging to see so many of you signing up for the program today. Next slide, please. We're going to now move into a discussion of some of the other clauses. We're going back to the beginning of the contract now to clauses 2, 3, and 4 and talk about the obligations of the parties and the role of the engineer. We'll start off with the employer. Next slide, please. This role has substantially changed in the 2021 editions because we've introduced the engineer in the second edition. You'll also find that we have regrouped several concepts that you would find in the fuller versions of FIDIC contracts. We've regrouped the concepts of right of access and possession of the site, and also the financial arrangements clause is, as you would expect it to be, under the employer's clause 2. Of course, not all the obligations are listed under clause 2 for the employer. You'll find his obligations spread out through the contract conditions. For example, clause 8, the employer's obligation to make the payments, etc. There are new model forms that have been included notably for access and for the financial arrangements. Those are included in the guidance notes. And one quick comment you might have been used to seeing in the 1999 edition, that permits and licenses were handled under clause 2. That's been moved to subclause 1.7 in the 2021 editions. And also you can see in the contract data, we've established a table where you can complete which party is responsible for which permits. There are a few things that have been pre-filled in that part of the contract data, notably the building permit being assigned to the employer, but you can make other arrangements based on the project's particular needs. The guidance notes addresses stage possession of the site in case you have, say, linear work and you're not handing over the site in one go, and you have to plan progressive and staged handovers. The guidance notes are there to help you with that. The guidance notes also provides an example, a special provision for withholding of the site possession in the event of failure to provide the performance security, provided that that option has been selected in the contract data. Next slide, please. The engineer. As I said, the engineer is a new feature in the 2021 second edition. You'll recognize him. He's very much the same as what you would find in the Green Book's Big Brothers. He can assign authority, except whenever he's required to make a determination under subclause 3.5. He's deemed to act for the employer, except he or she shall act neutrally when making determinations, and the engineer is to act fairly when certifying payments. There's exceptions to specific authority if that's the case. If some of the authority that's been granted under the conditions is not to be allowed, then you will want to give the employer's consent, perhaps, for certain actions of the engineer, but that's got to be stated in the contract data, and that cannot be changed after contract signature. Of course, the engineer has authority to issue instructions. And if the instruction is a variation, then the variation clause 7, as Mahmoud has described, that will take over and you'll follow the procedures there. And same as always in FIDIC contracts, approvals, consents, etc., they do not relieve the contractor from any obligation or responsibility. The underlying liability of the contractor to undertake his duties and obligations correctly, that remains despite approvals or consents from the engineer. Couple comments. Vincent's already mentioned this. There is no time bar provisions on the employer or contractor claims procedures for the engineer to oversee and manage. That's one of the major simplifications in the short form. The guidance notes gives sample special provisions to include the possibility of having interpreters for the personnel, engineers personnel, in case of non-fluency in the contract language. That's permitted by special provision. The guidance notes also include references to the FIDIC Code of Ethics and to the anti-corruption guidelines. The links are here, and highly recommend you take some time to look at those. Again, we have new model forms for the engineer's instructions and notice of agreement or determination. And also, we have different model forms for instructions of a variation and requests for a variation proposal. And just a quick word, the engineer is really supposed to try to determine when he issues an instruction if he believes this is a variation of the contract, and use those latter forms in cases where he has considered it to be a variation. However, if he issues an instruction, a plain instruction under clause 3, and later it turns out that that is a variation to the contract, it will be treated as such. Next slide, please. Turning now to the contractor, you'll find the layout of the clause reasonably similar to the other FIDIC forms of contract, and certainly the overall obligations are quite similar. There's a clause on general obligations. There's a clause on the contractor's representative and other personnel. The care of the works obligation of the contractor has been wrapped up into clause 4. There is a subclause on contracting. Just a few words on that one, as I know there's often a lot of interest in this. The 2021 edition retains the ban on subcontracting the whole of the works, just like the 99 FIDIC editions do, but it doesn't go any further than that, offering other options as you find in the 2017 editions. There is an example special provision for encouraging local subcontractor opportunities, which is a feature that the multilateral development banks often want to include in the contract. I mentioned performance security a little bit earlier. There is an option for that. You have to check it in the contract data. That's all you need to do. However, once you check yes, all the machinery that you need for performance security is already baked into the conditions of contract. No other special provisions are needed. In fact, there's expanded details on when you can call the performance security. There is a model form for the performance security. And in general, I would say, the drafting of the conditions assumes that a performance security is going to be required. But you'll see almost every time it's mentioned, you'll see if any, and that's simply because you do need to remember to check yes or no in the contract data on whether you're going to pick up that option. Contractors' documents, of course, are covered. The extent of the contractor's documents, the scope needs to be set out in the contract, typically in the specifications. Typically, FIDIC doesn't say much on these. The Green Book, we say even less. So that needs to be filled out project by project, depending on your needs. It does cover a few basic points, of course. It does say that the engineer's review period will either be stated in the specifications, or if it is not, by default, it's going to be 14 days under subclause 4.6. It does state no commencement of works without engineers, no objection, and that can be with or without comments. But there is, of course, a deemed no objection after the expiry of the review period. A big feature of the 2021 contract is that contractors' design is catered for in a very flexible way. There are expanded details in the conditions about where some design by the contractor is going to be required. That, of course, should be clearly set out in employer's requirements under the specifications. There is a very simple example special provision on how to convert the regular Green Book into a complete contractor's design scenario. It's really quite simple, and that option's available if you really want to turn this into design by the contractor style. And this all ties in with the flexibility of the payment valuation options that Mahmoud has covered under Clause 8. So this all fits together quite nicely and gives you a great deal of flexibility on how to deal with design. Under subclause 1.5, there is a broad provision on dealing with errors in documents, whether they're produced by the contractor or the employer. And that, of course, then will cover any employer's requirement errors that would appear if you have a contractor's design. Next slide, please. Other examples exist for special provisions, flexibility in the language requirements, consent for material suppliers. In the guidance notes, you'll find that suggested consideration for tests on and after completion. The general conditions do not discuss this in any material way. Plus, there's also consideration if you want to add performance guarantee and performance damages with a cross-reference to the Yellow Book, which you can use for inspiration. There's also a number of model forms related to the contractor. I'm not going to go through them now for the interest of time, but you can see the list on the right-hand side of the screen. Next slide, please. Moving on to the execution phase, focusing on quality and taking over. I'd like to cover Clause 5 and 9 now. Clause 5 is a roll-up clause and synthesizes the clauses 7, 9, and 11 from the full-length conditions covering workmanship, testing, and defects. It's short, it's succinct, but it still is an expansion on the 1999 Green Book conditions. There are short references to quality assurance, to inspection, to testing, HSC requirements, with details to be drafted contract by contract have to be included by the users in the specifications because the details are not covered in any way. But it does make sure that it's covered some very important elements. It specifically talks about right to inspection and test on or off site. That's the engineer's and employer's right to instruct works to be uncovered if needed. Similar extension of the DNP rights that you would find in the Green Book's Big Brothers, and similar employer rights to repair if contractor does not repair notified defects, step-in rights for the employer. There are, again, a couple model forms. I will just mention that there is a notice of readiness for inspection. That's in case you want to use that, but I would note that there is not a notice requirement to get the engineer and give the engineer an opportunity to inspect before covering up, as you'd find in the full-length FIDIC forms. Next slide, please. Taking over, this also under Clause 9, it does expand the concepts of taking over and now, as Vincent said earlier, generally aligns them with the fuller FIDIC forms of contract. Notice from the contractor is given when it considers that the works have been substantially completed. This is slightly different than the other FIDIC forms, which states that the notice should be given 14 days in advance of the expected completion. We've added a requirement for a taking over certificate. That was not actually a concept in the 99 edition. Thank you. There is no deemed taking over for failure by the engineer to respond within 28 days. Taking over accommodates the concept of sections, and the taking over certificate can include a list of defects and minor outstanding works to be done. We are on the substantial completion format as in the past. Again, though, the details do need to be completed in the specifications. If you're going to add anything on tests on completion or after completion, as-built manuals, O&Ms, but the subclause does say that if they are there, they must be passed before you can give notice for taking over. A new feature in the 99, aligning itself with the FIDIC tradition, of course, is taking over parts of the works, and deemed taking over by use has been added. And again, you have a list of model forms that go with the Clause 9. Next slide, please. We'll move on to time now. Subclause 6.2 deals with program. It's a very simple clause now. 14 days after commencement, the initial program needs to be submitted, or any revised program. The engineer is given a 14-day period to give notice of the extent to which the program does not comply with the contract, if there's any deviations. But keep in mind that this is not approval or consent, that it's only to be used when there is a non-compliance with the contract condition, say the time for completion isn't being met, for instance. The contractor then proceeds with that as his program. The concept, of course, in FIDIC being that we want programs in place as soon as possible, and we understand that the contractor is responsible for performance. Next clause, next paragraph. There's also an advanced warning provision in the new Green Books. Both parties have that duty to advise. It concerns delay, disruption, impact on the contract price. And it's important to highlight that the engineer also has this obligation to provide advanced warning. The extension of time for completion clause is 6.4. It will entitle a contractor to an EOT for any of the employer's risks that Mahmoud has run down, variations as have been covered, and a cause of delay giving entitlement to EOT under any subclause of the conditions. Clause 13 is going to apply in that situation, except in the case of variations where that is standalone. Same tradition in the new Green Book as FIDIC usually has. Negative EOTs cannot be imposed by an engineer's determination. Next slide. One of the bigger innovations that Vincent mentioned is the prolongation costs, which is a type of liquidated damage now. It's defined, and we refer to them as PGCs. It means on-site and off-site overheads, and it's associated with a compensable EOT as stated in the contract data. You need to do a little math for this. It's going to vary because it's going to be different at different stages. You need to figure out two things. First of all, you need to look at the value of works carried out at the time of the delay event. And we have 4 periods before work actually starts, in the first third, middle third, and the last third. Then we have W, which is a average of site indirect costs that could be incurred. We calculate that by looking at the initial contract price. We divide that by the initial time for completion, and we consider that 20% should cover all the average cost of indirects, including site and off-site overheads. You then plug that into the formula in the contract data. If the value of works is 0, in other words, we've not started, PGCs will be calculated at 25% of W, because obviously the indirect costs are lower at that period of time. In the middle 1/3, the PGC costs will rise to 60% of W. Sorry, in the first 1/3. In the middle 1/3, it will go to 125%, because at that period of time, you'll be looking at the most exposure to indirect costs. And we come back down again in the last 1/3 of the project, back down to 60% of W. Claims will still be permitted, of course, for loss of productivity. That's not related to these indirect fixed costs. But I do put the emphasis on these must be compensable EOT. We're hoping that this will solve some of the problems and difficulties in trying to figure out damages. It will not be a be-all, end-all solution to the very complex question of determining extension of time. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. 2 other clauses to cover. Time clause 6 has subclause 6.6 dealing with exceptional events. There is a definition of that at subclause 1.1.23. It looks very similar to what civil law practitioners would call force majeure. The event must be beyond a party's control, could not have reasonably been provided against, could not have been reasonably avoided, and not substantially attributable to the other party. If those 4 events altogether, they're cumulative, are brought together, then the party who's claiming the exceptional event is excused from performing those impacted obligations, which means he gets an EOT only if the completion is delayed. But keep in mind that an exceptional event can also be an employer's risk, and that in some conditions that means recovery of cost plus profit will be an available option. But that's in a situation where there was actually loss or damage to the works, physical loss or damage to the works, and the engineer has instructed repairs. Cost only without profit can sometimes be due in the case of certain man-made exceptional events, so long as those happen inside the country, or if we're talking about war or a similar type of event that happens anywhere in the globe. And finally, the delay damages clauses for contractors' delay is, of course, still there. That's subclause 6.5. I won't talk about that very much. You're very used to seeing these clauses. There's a daily amount of delay damages to be calculated, a maximum cap, and there's a table in the contract data for your use if you're using sectional completions. And of course, there's going to be a proportional reduction for taking over of any part of the permanent works. Thank you. That was the last slide.
Thank you very much, Jim, for your presentation. I would now turn to Robert for a presentation of further features of the new Green Book. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Marcel. I will talk first about suspension and termination, which we have separate and make different pathways. So we start with suspension and termination by the contractor, which is now a mandatory sequence. So in 4 specific events, the contractor may notify the intention to suspend, giving reasonable time to cure for the employer before there's a possibility to initiate termination, which requires the first notice of intention to terminate and then a second notice of termination. So again, like the 2017 suite, we have 2 notices in case of termination to just make it sure. And there is a curing period and possibilities in between. There's, as I mentioned, 4 specific events. I think you all know these. They are not new. If the engineer fails to certify an IPC, or the employer fails to pay, or the employer fails to comply with the financial arrangement provisions, that would be the A and B provisions. And then what we introduced here, but in line with the 2017 edition, if the employer fails to comply with an agreement or determination under subclause 3.5 agreement or determination, or with a decision of an adjudicator, and such failure constitute a material breach, and likewise the employer substantially fails to perform, and here also such failure constitute a material breach of the employer's obligation under the contract. There's a shortcut in case of 3 also specified events. The contractor may have a direct entitlement to issue a notice of termination under subclause 10.3.2. I think the entire concept is more or less very familiar to all FIDIC users. What we have introduced here, just an endeavor to make it more easy, more sure to avoid discussions and claims, as we have introduced a liquidated damages concept in the event of termination. So here the contractor has an entitlement to get 10% of the value of the uncompleted works at date of termination, just as a liquidated damages provision or similar to that. And likewise, more or less similar, the termination by the employer, there's no suspension, but the employer has to notify under the first trial, and we have 3 trials. The employer may to follow in the endeavor to terminate a contract. The contractor has a substantial failure of his obligations, and that constitute a material breach. Then we have the notice of default, which needs to be given by the employer, where there's a reasonable time for the contractor to remedy. If that's not going to happen, then the employer may, and that may is a may, and move on to notice to termination by submitting a notice of intention to terminate. The first notice, if there's no curing, then the second notice of termination may be issued. So again, we have under this 2 termination notice to be given. We have a second trial where we have 4 specific events. That's corruption, bankruptcy, etc. Also very familiar for those who are frequently working under FIDIC conditions. Nothing too much new here. Then the employer has a direct possibility to terminate the contract, which is again just the typical concept. We have also, already I've seen the question here in the chat box related to an employer's termination at convenience. Yes, that is possible. We have introduced that as a separate trial because it's a separate, more civil law applicable procedure how to terminate a contract. Even though we have done this with several trials, we have also introduced liquidated damages provision. So if the employer terminates a contract for a valid reason, then he can deduct the value of incomplete work at 20%. And unless it is a termination at convenience, then the contractor has an entitlement for compensation of 10% of the uncompleted works. So liquidated damages provision here and there, just to cater that we try to avoid to the utmost possible discussion and quantum discussion when the payment provision itself is rather clear. Any shortcut we believe here is to the advantage, even though we know we will not end up in a precise figure, but that's the same as delay damages. The range is acceptable, and it gives an easy to handle provision for the parties. They should agree on that when they sign the contract. Moving on to claims, you see we have also very simple provisions, only 3 subclauses regarding to claim. We define the right to claim, we talk about the procedure, and we have a short duty to mitigate. So if you go a little bit closer to the claims, you will identify that we have taken on board the concept of the 2017 edition, the modern view, that claims can be accrued between the parties. So either party may consider itself to be entitled, and then that claiming party shall submit to the engineer a notice describing the event. So here identify the concepts have been upheld within 28 days. And the second step is a fully detailed claim with supporting particular within 56 days after the claiming party became or should have become aware of the said event or circumstances. And the claim procedure itself is rather simplified. It just says that upon receiving a fully detailed claim, so the terms have been upheld, the engineer shall proceed in accordance with subclause 3.5 to agree or determine the entitlement or relief of the claiming party. As already said by my colleagues, we have no time bar provision in the Green Book. We found that inappropriate, as no significant contract administration or management resources are required under these conditions. That what was most probably the motivation to opt for the Green Book, and that we have a lighter concept. However, if the claiming party fails to comply with this time-wise submission of the documents just said on the previous slide, which means the intention was to alert the other party, to make them aware that something is ongoing, and then this failure may also enable the decising party, later on the engineer or the adjudicator, to consider that late submission prevented the other party from doing anything against it, to neutralize the event, as we may say. So there's a possibility to take the failure to submit in time into the account if that is appropriate. The typical sequence of claim, that's what we have provided as one of the sequences. So the guidance, the support for the parties is this slide. In the FIDIC world, we are event-driven people, and that remains. So the first step is to identify the event giving rise to the claim or the circumstances. Step 2 is submitting the notice of claim describing the event or circumstances giving rise to the claim. The step 3 is within 56 days to submit the fully detailed claims with supporting particulars, and that's also in contemporary records, so all the principles are upheld here. And after that, the engineer's activity kick in, where the engineer shall consult with both parties and endeavor to reach agreement. And of course, in that function, the engineer is required to act neutrally. And if we don't achieve an agreement with the support of the engineer, for which the engineer shall give a notice to the parties, and then the engineer is required within step number 4 and with a time period of 42 days to give a notice of determination. Of course, with supporting particulars, each and any step must be properly reasoned, so always with supporting particulars. And then we move on to step number 5, which simply states that each party shall give effect to the agreement which they have achieved with the other party, or the determination made by the engineer under subclause 3.5. So a determination is binding, and if then any party is dissatisfied, they can issue a notice of dissatisfaction referred to dispute resolution, typical FIDIC concept, so nothing here. And so more or less the same procedure without the strict time bar provision, as this is not appropriate under the Green Book as we have drafted it. We have included now a contractual explicit obligation for either party to mitigate the effect of any claim regarding time and payment. So I think that's rather new to have it implied, no, expressly said, not implied, but otherwise, of course, we also had that before. Moving on to something which is also important, dispute prevention and dispute resolution. You can see here at the bottom of the slide, we have applied the golden principle, FIDIC golden principle number 5, that alternative dispute resolution shall be applied as a condition precedent before arbitration. So we have included adjudication in a more adjusted way. So we have insisted on an early appointment for the adjudicator by the parties, which shall be done within 28 days after the contract is agreed or otherwise agreed by the parties. We have some guidance how to select the adjudicator, and there's a default provision, which means that then finally the president of FIDIC will decide finally and conclusive on the adjudicator. However, in standard, we have only introduced one adjudicator, taken in consideration that maybe the Green Book will be used in rather smaller project, but if the size reaches a decent value in terms of money, there's also possibility to adjust that. We have no retainer, but an option for that. So there's a kind of flexibility, and I will discuss that on the next slide. What we have done, we have drafted 26 rules for adjudication, and we have introduced the language which is familiar to most of the people dealing with dispute and dispute resolution. So we are talking about a straightforward of a referral now. The claiming party has to submit a referral. That would be the starting point for any decision-making process, which has a clear period. We have drafted in a way that it might be not necessary to hold a hearing if it's a small project and a more simplified issue. And then the decision shall be made within 56 days, but a hearing as a possibility, and of course, natural justice and all the things complied with, then the procedure, the period will be extended to the well-known 84 days, like we have it in other major contract forms. So that's about this. We move on to this slide. You see we have the same structure as in other major forms. We have an appendix rule for adjudication, which contains these 26 rules I already said. We have an appendix form of adjudicators agreement, so everything is pre-drafted. There's not much for the parties to discuss in order to apply the appropriate dispute adjudication procedure. But as a feature which we may present here as well, that the Green Book provides for 3 options. And that's for the parties to decide. They may use the adjudicator only for binding decisions. They may go for the option number 2 to request from time to time also informal assistance plus the binding decisions. So engage the adjudicator a little bit more, as it is already there is already appointed and available, or go on to option number 3 to upgrade the adjudicator into a regular standing board, and then have the possibility to have regular informal assistance, which may include also site visits and of course the binding decision. That's a pool of options which can be agreed and also be changed during the procedure by agreement of the parties. Everything is pre-agreed and preset here, so the parties are always guided how to make the further steps in order to achieve what they wish to agree on. What we have introduced, and that's the new feature, and so far we have received quite a lot of positive response on that. We have drafted what we have called forms of communication. So in small words, whenever the general conditions require either party or the engineer to give notice or another form of a defined communication to the other party or the engineer, which is very often just a submission of a defined message, we have drafted, pre-drafted a communication form. So that gives the users and some kind of understanding who has to send to whom what is a required spread of message, and how it could be drafted easily with concise, easy filling form, cross-reference to the correct subclauses. Has to be said that they are not part of the contract. They shall not become part of the contract. They're of course based on the unamended general contract conditions. It would not work with particular conditions, which anyway are not necessary too much for green books. And we have not provided any forms for termination, and that should require sufficient sophisticated legal review before using these. How to use a form is quite easy. On the right part of the slide, you see just an example, notice of agreement or determination. On the left part, you see the structure for using the forms. So the first figure will tell you who is using this, who is the sender of this form. It can be used by employer, contractor, engineer, or by everybody. Then you will find a circle. The middle part describes what kind of communication is that. Is it a notice, request, certificate, claim, instruction, whatever? And the last part just describes the subclause under which this communication form is issued. Just an example here, we have mentioned notice of agreement or determination. Certainty is what we are looking for. So from the view of the engineer should make clear when the parties have agreed on something to put that agreement on records. If the parties weren't able to find this agreement, maybe it's necessary for the engineer to make a determination. Both activities are under subclause 3.5. So here the engineer may choose whatever action is appropriate, just fill that out related to the matter of discussion and put it on record and submit it to both parties. And if it's an agreement or determination, thereon it shall be given effect by both parties. That's what the contract anyway says. And that puts the engineer in a very nice situation, effective, fast way solution, and everything is recorded, everything is certain, and that's actually what we require for the next step to proceed. And I conclude my presentation with this slide. Thank you for joining us for today. Happy to answer with my colleagues any question which you have left over in the chat box or wish to raise now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So it's now time to turn to the questions from the audience. We have some minutes for that. I would just pick a first question, which is for you, Jim, and which I see that you answered in the discussion area. There was a question about whether the loss of productivity is claimable, and how is the productivity loss valued, in the sense that we have already, of course, expanded on the concept of prolongation costs. It's now a defined term. We have not, however, made any express reference to disruption costs in our form. So would you like to expand on this, Jim?
Thanks, Vincent. I just published an answer to that question. Disruption is obviously a very complex question, but I think the key takeaway from today is that disruption costs are separate from the prolongation costs and the liquidated damages that we've defined in the Green Book. It's a separate head of claim. And yes, they can be claimable. An example might be if you had a claim under subclause for unforeseen physical conditions, now under 11.1. It might not have delayed the time for completion, but it could have disrupted the work. You could have encountered much harder rock than anticipated. That could have slowed down production, and that could perhaps give you entitlement for a lost productivity claim. You then have to go through regular legal standards of proof of damages once you've established entitlement. And in that situation, you're going to find there's a number of different methods. I've mentioned in the answer that you may want to look to the Society of Construction Law Protocol on delay and disruption. One common method they mention is the measured mile. Difficult to go into more detail in such a short seminar, but the short answer is yes, it's claimable, and take away that it is not part of the prolongation cost.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And indeed, yeah, the reason why we expanded on prolongation cost, one of the reasons is that, of course, there was a good way to capture those prolongation costs as liquidated damages provision for the sake of ease of contract administration. But of course, the same does not apply on the for disruption cost, and that requires a fact-based analysis which prevents the use of a liquidated damage provision. I will now turn to, and just for the participants, and do not hesitate to raise further questions in the discussion area, I will now turn to Mahmoud. There was a question regarding whether the engineer is under an obligation to explain a rejection of the contractor's rejection to execute a variation. So that's in connection with our new provision under clause 7.1.2, where we provide that there are several grounds to object to a variation requested by the engineer, and those grounds echo what you already have now in the 2017 red, yellow, and silver book. And there is a possibility, of course, for the contractor to object to a request for a proposal from the engineer. And in case the engineer reject that rejection from the contractor, the question is whether the engineer is under an obligation to explain his position. So I think you could probably guide us through this new provision, because there is no such rejection of the rejection as such, which is expressly contemplated.
Yes, there isn't indeed. So, but when the contractor rejects, he needs to cite and make reference to 7.1.2 and mention what ground is he relying on to reject the variation. And now, if the engineer objects, let's not forget that this is the second route, which is the by request for variation, proposal for variation. So chances are the variation may not be necessary, and the engineer or the employer through the engineer is just testing the water. He wants to know how much it's going to cost, likely how long it's going to take. However, we have not really addressed that in express terms, that the engineer has to explain why he objects to the objection. If the variation turns out to be required in any case, the engineer has the option to still instruct the variation. If it turns out at that time or that stage that the varied work is required, the engineer can always instruct the variation under the first route, and then the procedure under 7.1.1a will apply, i.e. in that case, the contractor will be under the obligation to execute the variation, unless indeed the contractor has merit in the rejection in the first place. So it will be a matter of assessing that on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't, I mean, if it's a matter of one of the three grounds, if it's unforeseeable, as I mentioned in my slide, unforeseeable is a defined term. So there will be an assessment and review of that ground. If it turns out to be, let's say, an acceptable rejection, then obviously, bearing in mind that this route is always resorted to for, I would say, optional variations or variations that may or may not be indeed required by the employer or the engineer.
Yeah, thank you, Mahmoud. And I think it's a good question to highlight a subtle nuance that we have in the Green Book 2021 compared to Red Book 2017 or Yellow Book 2017 or Silver Book, in the sense that we have provided here more strength to the contractor's objections, in the sense that whenever there is an objection from the contractor to a request for a proposal for variation or to an instruction of variation, those three objections ground that you have mentioned now, the contractor can hold to that, and the engineer will not have the power to overrule the objection, as in the case of Red or Yellow Book, where it was expressly provided in clause 13.1 that despite the objection, then the engineer has the power to confirm the instruction despite the objection, in which case the only remedy left for the contractor would be to look at the law, whether the applicable law would provide such an objection against what could be seen as a cardinal change to the works, for example. In the Green Book, we took another approach, which is in a recognition of the fact that we are dealing with potentially smaller contractors, and which needs somehow a little bit of higher protection against what would be a cardinal change. I would turn to Robert. Robert, we had a question that you already answered regarding employer's termination at will for convenience. That's now in the book. But there was another question as to whether the engineer has an obligation now to issue a determination for interim claims, and which can take you to comment on the reason why we do not talk about expressly about interim claims in clause 13.
Yeah, I think the contract is clear. Upon receiving the fully detailed claim, the engineer has to make a determination. So the contractor has to comply with this requirement unless there's no obligation for the engineer. I think that making a determination on interims or continuous effect claims, etc., that is related under the time provision where contractors have to submit earlier as possible and then to update, etc. Those contract administration requirements we don't have. Fully detailed claims has to be submitted, and then the engineer's activity kicks in.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. And also regarding the question raised, I would draw the attention of the person who raised the question that in the 2017 edition of Red, Yellow, and Silver books, now you expressly have an obligation for the engineer to act upon an interim claim, and that is set out under subclause 373. There were also some generic comments here made about whether the 99 version will remain available. Yes, we do not retire our contracts as usual, so you can still use the 99 edition if you find that suitable for your project, and similarly to what happened in many areas across the world where our 99 edition is still being used, or even the 1987. So that will continue to be available to the market for use. We have then another question in connection with variations. So I would turn back to you, Mahmoud. In the case where a variation is issued that changes what is in the original contract data, should the engineer issue an updated revision of the contract data? For example, when a variation adds a new section to the works.
Yeah, I mean, this I probably will use the lawyer's standard or classic, answer, which is depends. I mean, if this is a completely new section that needs to be added to the ones listed in the contract data under a new variation, well, depending on how the variation is communicated, is it a variation order or a change notice? I mean, under a format that the variation will be issued in a template of variation, which both parties will sign off onto. In that case, it could be mentioned that the contract data shall be deemed amended to include the new section being such and such. In other cases, depending on the contract administration mode, there will be some amendments issued to the contracts, i.e. as a result of that variation, they might attach to that notice of variation or variation form a copy of the contract data amended to incorporate the new section. So it all depends on the format that has been used by the parties to formalize variations. It's not a must, but it could be done in other ways. If it has to be done, then it could be issued, like as I said, as a revised page or of the original contract, depending on how they agreed from the outset to handle those formalities.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point, Mahmoud. I think it's important to highlight that the whole contract machinery for dealing with variations and their impact does not require any formal amendment to the contract per se. It's all built in. And of course, the two parties can agree to create a new section if they want, but if there is no such agreement, then at the end of the day, it will be a fact-based analysis as to what is the time impact, the delay impact, for example, of the variation, whether it affects the critical path of the whole of the works or a section, so that the engineer can determine what extension of the time for completion is required and whether for a particular section or for the whole of the works.
Agreed. And so just one quick thing. I mean, the instruction would include that. I mean, as I said, it depends on what the extent to which they would like to formalize that. But if the instruction says we hereby add a new section being such and such and such, then that it has been formalized. And I think once the proposal comes back after the contractor proceeds, then and it's accepted, then as I mentioned earlier, depending on how much they would like to additionally formalize it. But as you mentioned, yes, the variation does not necessarily automatically means an amendment to the contract.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And the last question for Jim. Jim, it's in connection with taking over certificates. We have two questions, actually. Could you explain a bit further regarding the taking over certificate? If it's not issued after completion of the works, how long can the DNP be extended? And a related question, which is what happened now if the deemed taking over is not available because there is no deeming provisions? What recourse does the contractor have if the engineer does not respond after a certain period of time?
I'll start with the last question. If the engineer doesn't respond and does not issue the taking over certificate, well, the question is a matter of fact. The works were substantially complete or they weren't. In other words, were you able to put them to use substantially as they were intended to perform the purpose? And that's a matter of fact. And if the engineer isn't responding, then you may need to go to the adjudicator to get that matter of fact determined. Don't forget, though, there is also another deeming taking over, and that's by use. So if at some point in time there's no certificate issued, but the employer actually starts to use the works, then that's also going to be deemed as taking over. But you may need to get the adjudicator involved, and he will issue a determination, a decision, rather after the fact. And unfortunately, it can be sometimes well too long after the actual date of substantial completion. That ties into the second question of the DNP. The DNP provisions won't change, and the DNP extension will be determined only once somebody, an adjudicator, or in the worst case scenario, an arbitrator, has decided when factually the taking over should have been pronounced through a certificate.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this concise and precise answer. It's now time to wrap up for the seminar. So thank you all for your participation and for the questions from the floor. I would now turn to Daduna for a few conclusion words.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for your excellent moderation of your presentation, and also to Jim, Mahmoud, and Robert for their excellent presentations and insights. It's great to see so many questions coming in. Time is short, so we do have to end this webinar, but we will have another opportunity to engage and to respond to more questions. As a reminder, FIDIC will be hosting the FIDIC International Contract Users Conference later this year in November in London, and we encourage the attendees to come to network in person to this event. And with that, I would like to thank all the attendees joining the event today and encourage to stay engaged with FIDIC. And also a big thank you to FIDIC team behind the scenes to organize this webinar. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Taduna. And maybe a last word about an upcoming online training for the Green Book, the new Green Book by FIDIC Academy. So you can visit FIDIC Academy website and it will be on as of 17 November.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.